Hi, and welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing with our look at an architectural movement that we know of as the Chicago School. And the Chicago School we can think of as an interesting combination of a development upon arts and crafts that came together with a whole variety of other architectural impetuses or influences, all that came together in a particular way in Chicago in the reconstruction after the fire in the 1870s. And the two big names that we associate with Chicago School are Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright. We've seen that Frank Lloyd Wright spent some time in Louis Sullivan's office, and so we can assume that he picked up some of the basic lessons that Sullivan had to teach him about an organic design process, about the basic form of a building, and about the use of ornament. But we're going to see that Wright goes off in his own direction. And this becomes clear when he sets off on his own architecturally, sets up his own practice in 1893, and begins accepting commissions and building buildings around the Chicago area. What we see is that where he goes with all of this is with an arts and crafts that is increasingly non-historical. From the earliest buildings that were still very much a reinterpretation of historical traditions, specifically vernacular traditions, we can see that he's going to move away from something that appears to be so inspired by history. We're going to see that he embraces the machine. And this is a pretty radical thing for an architect to do who is so closely tied to some basic arts and crafts ideas. Arts and crafts, in many ways, was a rejection of industrialization, the capitalist system that lay at the root of industrialization, and the way that industrialization had side effects that were considered to be unfortunate with regards to socioeconomic issues and also design issues. And so a lot of arts and crafts architects moved away from any use of modern materials or machine manufacturing. We're going to see that Wright embraces the machine. He looks for ways in which the machine and industrial production can really give him other opportunities. And he's not going to turn his back on that. And then we're also going to see that Wright is constantly looking for ways to draw inspiration from the landscape and the local flora and fauna. None of the buildings that he did that I'm aware of are intended to imitate naturally occurring events. And so nothing looks like it's a log fallen over in the forest. Nothing that he designed looks like a mushroom. None of it looks like it's a rock that was inhabited. But all of the buildings, in one way or the other, are going to draw inspiration from the landscape or try to be a man-made composition that harmonizes with the landscape in one way or the other, probably in a variety of different ways. And so with the different buildings, we're going to, in some cases more, in some cases less, but we're going to see that the landscape was going to be very interesting for what Wright was going to do with his architectural development. We're also going to see that from the earliest buildings that he did, there is a very interesting relationship to geometry and an expression of geometry. Just taking a look at these two houses, both in the Chicago area from around 1900. One is from the 1890s, one is from the 1900s. We're going to see the two ways in which he used geometry. If we take a look at the Winslow house, we can see basic cubic three-dimensional geometry pretty clearly expressed in the design of the house. If we take a look at the Willits house, on the other hand, we're going to see, first of all, what he called a pinwheel plan for the house. A good example of, from the central fireplace core, different wings of the house extending off in different directions in a plan that looks vaguely like a pinwheel. And when we take a look at the planning of the building and the expression of the building on the outside, we're going to see that there's this reliance on two-dimensional planes as a sort of design starting off point. Two-dimensional rectangular planes that are extending out from that fireplace core and overlapping at their corners at that fireplace core. We'll come back to this, but for our lecture today, let's just keep in mind that there are these two different ways of using geometry that Wright was going to tap into in these early years, and geometry is going to continue to be a really basic part of his architectural expression throughout his career. One of the earliest buildings that we're going to take a look at is Unity Temple in Oak Park, Illinois. Oak Park is a suburb just to the west of the city of Chicago. This was the suburb where Wright built a house and studio for himself and for his young family. And Unity Temple was a church for a congregation of Unitarians. Wright and his family were Unitarians. They were members of the congregation. And so when the congregation decided to build a new church complex for themselves, naturally they were going to ask a member of their congregation to design the complex. And so Wright took over the commission for the building. And as a matter of fact, this is just a few blocks away from Wright's home and studio. If you go to Chicago today, it's possible to tour his home and studio, and it's also possible to tour Unity Temple. And I would highly recommend that. And if you get the chance, it's possible to walk the couple of blocks from one to the other and set up both of the tours on the same day if you're interested in doing that. When we take a look at the church complex, we're going to see something about the site. It's not a particularly large site. It's right on a corner. And when we take a look at the buildings and the diagrams of the building in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, we're going to see the reliance upon geometry, and especially the reliance upon that cubic three-dimensional geometry that I had just mentioned. Perhaps the two axonometric diagrams to the right of that image up there sort of makes obvious exactly what he was doing in the composition here. For the part of the building that's pulled closest to the corner, which is the church proper within the complex here, we can see the way that he's using these different rectangular three-dimensional volumes and sort of organizing them around this almost cubic form right in the middle of that part of the composition. But a very clear example of that sort of cubic three-dimensional geometry that I mentioned about Wright's early architectural career. When we take a look at some of the details here, we can see the way that the geometry is being manipulated in order to create the details in the building. Wright is also going to draw inspiration from some of the local flora and the connection between the seed heads of the sumac plant, which we can see here in the photograph, and many of the repeated forms that we can see in the structural supports in the church proper within the complex has been noted by all sorts of scholars and all sorts of people who look at Wright's architecture. One thing that I think is interesting to note here, though, is when we take a look at the precision and the repetition of the detail in those structural supports, we're going to see something that doesn't appear to have the imperfections that would show the hand of a craftsman in a workshop. Rather, we see something that is small scale, that is precise, and that is repeated. And all of this begins to hint at a sort of manufacturing, a sort of industrial manufacturing that is a bit different from the hand-hewn, handcrafted details that we might see, for example, in the Red House or in the architecture of Green and Green. Here it appears that Wright is developing an aesthetic from some of the qualities that we would normally associate with industrial production. And so in perhaps a limited way here, we can see that embracing the machine in some of the architectural expression. Now, if we take a look at the plan of Unity Temple down below and compare and contrast it with a plan of a particular Japanese Buddhist temple, which is up above, we're going to see a pretty close correspondence between the two. In both cases, and I'm going to read this from right to left, in both cases we can see this oblong rectangular space. We can see this intermediary space, and then we can see this square area all the way to the left. If we were to go to the Buddhist temple, we would enter the temple from the right, go up those steps, and enter into an axial organization that would take us through those three different spaces. First into that transverse rectangular space, then through the transition space, and finally into what is the temple proper, what we would call the Hondo, where the devotional image is housed. And if we take a look at the complex, we see a sort of architectural expression that's very different from the show-in style that I've focused on in my lecture about Japanese architecture. Here, it's a building that's built out of wood and that uses the bracket system of wood construction, but where the wood is not immediately seen because it is finished with all of these bright colors and bright materials. And so even though it is a point load system of wood construction, and even though we might be able to see the bracket system that holds it together, most of the wood here is going to be lacquered, painted, gilded, something very different from that other architectural tradition that I focused on. But you might be able to make out from these different views the different parts of the temple complex, right? The entry area, the transition space, and then the Hondo proper. But if we were to compare and contrast that with the way that you enter into and move through the complex here at Unity Temple, we're going to see that for as much as Wright might have drawn inspiration from that Japanese temple, he's setting up the circulation through his complex in a completely different way. And we're going to see that he intentionally negates that axial organization through the different spaces. In the Japanese complex, the destination is the Hondo. In Unity Temple that Wright designed, the destination is going to be the church proper, which is in the square planned area, which corresponds to the Hondo. But how you get there is going to be radically different in Wright's design. If we take a look at the photograph down in the lower right of this slide, by the curb, you may see a little sign, a little vertical yellow sign, and you may see a planter, which is sort of behind and above that, a planter which is at the end of a little retaining wall. Now, if we were to find that planter and the retaining wall in the plan of the building, you might see a couple steps that are directly above that planter in plan, okay? That planter hides the steps from view in the photographic image, but you would have to go up those steps onto a terrace and then into the intermediary area. And then from there, you would either go to the right or you would go to the left. To the right would be a community center, a public space for the congregation. And then to the left would be the church proper. But even if you went to the left and wanted to enter into the church proper, even from that intermediary space, you would not be able to enter axially into the space. Rather, from that intermediary space, you might hang a left to get into the church proper, and you would come up against a wall. That wall is to the back of the choir, which is to the back of the pulpit, And when you hit that wall, you would either need to go to the right or to the left. And when you do, you'd find yourself in two of the corners where there are a lot of stairs that are organized. And from those corners, you could descend down into the pews that are at the ground floor area of the church proper, or you could ascend to some of the balcony spaces where there are additional pews. But let's just take a look for a minute and let's be cognizant about how complicated that process is to enter into the complex and to move into the church proper. Again, negating any sort of axial organization of the circulation through the whole thing to your destination in the church proper. Rather, you need to sort of rotate around the planter to come up to the terrace, move into that intermediary block, go to the left, face a wall, decide to go either to the right or to the left to the corners, and then down steps or up steps to find your way into the area where the pews are located. That's a pretty complicated little way of moving around this complex. And it is something that is not without significance when we think about the history of religious architecture in Western Europe and in North America. The congregation that this church complex was designed and built for is a Unitarian Universalist congregation. That is a denomination that has its roots in colonial America, specifically in the Massachusetts colony, back about the time of the American War of Independence. Each of the British colonies had an established religion to them. Most of the southern colonies had the Church of England or the Anglican Church as the state church for the colony. Pennsylvania, founded by Quakers, had religious liberty. That was built into to the colony there. Maryland was originally founded as a Catholic colony for Catholics who were being persecuted in England, but eventually, with more and more Anglican colonists showing up in Maryland, they soon overturned that, and Maryland also became a colony that had an established religion of the Anglican Church or the Church of England. In New England, most of the colonies were founded by dissenters from the Church of England. That means that they were Englishmen who didn't agree with the worship or with the governmental structure, if you want to call it that, and I'm making air quotes right now, the governmental structure of the Church of England. From the Catholic Church, the Church of England inherited a governmental system of bishops and archbishops. Also from the Catholic Church, the Church of England inherited many of the standard forms of worship, whether it was morning prayer, whether it was the Eucharist, as well as many parts of the liturgies and many of the settings for worship. The Separatists and the Puritans felt that a lot of that was inappropriate, and they wanted to purge the Church of England of many things that they considered to be Catholic. They wanted to purge the Church of England of its episcopal system, or the system of governance by bishops and archbishops. They wanted to remove many aspects of the liturgy that they felt were inappropriate, if not idolatrous. Often they took inspiration from the theology of John Calvin, who was a French Catholic priest who rebelled against the ecclesiology or the church structure, the theology, and the worship of Catholicism, fled to Switzerland, where he had a greater degree of religious freedom, and began organizing a different theology to Christianity that intentionally removed many of those Catholic aspects and sought to base the theology more closely upon Scripture. So many of these Englishmen who felt that the Church of England hadn't gone far enough in the Reformation drew inspiration from the theology of John Calvin, found themselves persecuted to one degree or another in England, and came to the English colony, well, founded some of the English colonies on the eastern seaboard of North America. And the Massachusetts colony, as well as Connecticut and many of the other original colonies, were some of these Puritans or separatists, again, who drew inspiration from Calvinist theology. Yet within each of those colonies, because there was this connection with the government of England, they were still ruled by the king and by the Parliament in London. The king and the Parliament insisted that there be Church of England congregations in these different colonies. In Boston, which was sort of the main city within the Massachusetts colony, there was a church, a congregation, and eventually a church that was intended to house the Anglicans who had emigrated to Massachusetts. And we're taking a look at that church here. It's called King's Chapel. It was a foundation sponsored specifically by the King of England to give worship space for the Anglicans who came here. And it was in a colony that was governed and set up specifically for the Calvinist-inspired Puritans and separatists. At the time of the American War of Independence, the connections between the different Anglican congregations in the United States and the governing bishops and archbishops back in England was strained, to say the least. And there was a lot of question about exactly how these Anglican congregations were going to continue to function if the bishops were English back in England and if the colonists were rebelling against the King of England, who was technically the head of the church. Lots of questions there. The minister at King's Chapel in Boston took this as an opportunity to begin to explore some aspects of theology that he wasn't exactly convinced of. And one of the most important aspects of the theology that he's going to delve into, examine, and eventually expunge from the worship at this particular church was the idea of the Christian God being a Trinitarian God. The Trinity is a doctrinal point of Christian theology that goes back to the earliest centuries of Christianity, but which was codified in the 4th century, largely under the direction, perhaps pressure, of the emperor in Rome. And basically what the Trinity says is that the Christian God has 3 different facets. One person, 3 facets: God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And that became enshrined in the different creeds that are used by many of the mainline Christian denominations, including the Anglicans, the Lutherans, but also is used by the Catholics and by the Orthodox Christians. And basically what it does is it states that Jesus was God. Now, that particular point was called into question by Christians throughout history, more or less. It was quite often persecuted, that viewpoint. But the minister at this particular church began to explore it, began to take a look at the Book of Common Prayer, which is one of the important documents of the Anglican Church or of the Church of England, and began to go through and sort of remove references to the Trinity. At the end of the American War of Independence, there was a way in which the former English colonies got their own Anglican bishops, and so this began to be the formation of the Episcopal Church in the United States, still affiliated with the Anglican Communion, but its own national church, even though it wasn't established by the nation, still a national church. But this particular congregation was no longer in unity with the Anglican Communion because they called into question Trinitarian doctrine. And this began to set off a number of other congregations that began to adopt a non-Trinitarian Christianity. And in New England, that led to the establishment of the Unitarian Universalist denomination. It continues today, and today they are very open to other religious traditions, not just Christian religious traditions, but a whole variety of religious traditions that they believe they can also draw wisdom from. And this was the denomination that Wright and his family adhered to. This was the denomination that had a congregation in Oak Park that supported or commissioned the new Unity Temple. And this was the congregation for whom that worship space was designed. Now, if we take a look at the tradition of religious architecture in Western Europe, we're going to see that many Protestant denominations moved very far away from the Catholic tradition that you may remember from History 2. When we took a look at Romanesque architecture in History 2 or Gothic architecture in History 2, we saw a definition of sacred space, which is qualitatively different from profane space, according to the thoughts and beliefs of the people who commission these buildings, use these buildings. The consecration of these buildings established space that, again, was qualitatively different from the non-sacred space or the profane space, which could be found outside the churches. And the architecture was intended to create a space that could house the sacred rites, but that would also encapsulate sacred space and inspire the faithful to participate in the religious rites and the religious ceremonies that took place within these buildings. What did Protestants think about these spaces? At the time of the Protestant Reformation, when so much Catholic theology and Catholic worship was called into question, there's a whole spectrum of responses to this tradition. Some of those responses were somewhat moderate, thinking that, okay, it's nice to have nice spaces for churches, but maybe we need to take out the images, maybe we need to take out things that seem inappropriate for churches. And by and large, that was the response of the Anglicans in England, or the Church of England, and most of the Lutherans. Just let's remove the statues and the candles, and we'll find a way to make these buildings work. But there were other religious groups, including the Calvinists and including other more radical reformers, who felt that the notion of sacred space was in and of itself idolatrous. You can't contain God in a building. You can't evoke God and bring him into space by the geometry, the proportion, the planning of the building, the way that light's brought into the building, things like that, right? And they certainly didn't like the statues and the artistic representations that they found in these churches. And so they engaged in what was known as iconoclasm, and we see one depiction of that in the watercolor woodcut that we see in the upper left here, where they would often barge into Catholic churches and violently remove the religious artwork that they felt was inappropriate. They would often reuse these buildings, and on the lower right we can see a reuse of a Gothic church in Holland, where the state religion, the established religion, was a Calvinist religion. And what we can see here, if you take a look at some of the liturgical furnishings here, well, first of all, you can see that any of the religious artwork is going to be removed. No more stained glass windows, no more statues that are of Jesus or the saints or anything like that. There are some memorials here to different donors to the church, but we don't have the altars, the statues, things that are associated with Catholic worship. Furthermore, if you take a look down the nave of the church, you can see that they set up a pulpit in the nave of the church, but in such a way that it isn't organized on that central axis. It's not the destination of the central axis. Rather, it's off to the side, and that would allow people to sort of gather around the pulpit in order to hear the preaching that was going to be made from that pulpit. When there were new buildings that needed to be built for Protestant congregations, often they'd be decent buildings, right? These weren't hovels, these weren't, barns or, something that was, I don't know, something that was poor architecture. They were decent buildings, but they intentionally avoided the axial organization. They intentionally avoided the planning and the geometry and all of the architectural ways in which the Catholic tradition and the Catholic notion of sacred space was enclosed. And here we're taking a look at the interior of a church building that was designed for another Calvinist congregation, and you can see that it's decent architecture. I mean, it's fine, but it's not laid out in a Latin cross. The axis into and through a Gothic church that you might find is not here. Rather, it's set up more as just a basic functional space, right? As something more along the lines of an auditorium. And so there is a very strong divide between 16th century Calvinist architecture, 16th century architecture of the radical reformers, an example of which we can see here on the left, and the 16th century architecture of the Catholic Church, which we can see here on the right, in an example designed by Palladio, in this case the Church of the Redentore in Venice, where that old tradition and the old conceptions of sacred space are continued recast in Renaissance architectural clothing. But still, there's this sense that you're entering into space that is qualitatively different from what's outside. The Calvinists and the Protestant reformers, the radical reformers, completely rejected any sense of sacred space. And that's evident in the architecture. And this was what was imported into the colonies in New England. Again, Puritan separatists who felt like the Anglican Church or the Church of England did not go far enough in the Reformation, and who reject completely the notion of sacred space. And when they designed and built buildings to house their worship services, they didn't even call them churches. What we're taking a look at here is a building that is known as Old Ship Meeting House in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and other of the non-conforming, non-Anglican colonies in what is today New England. They built meeting houses, and these would be spaces where people in the community could get together for a whole variety of different purposes. If there was a town council meeting, it would happen here. If they needed to organize something, it would happen here. But this is also where their worship service would occur. In their view, the architecture was not enclosing sacred space. In their view, the building itself had no architecture that was intended to glorify God or, do any of the other things that the Catholic churches did. This was just meeting space, and this is just where they happened to worship. The building did not represent the church or the body of Christ in any way, shape, or form. This was the tradition out of which the Unitarians developed and grew in New England. And this was going to be part of the religious tradition that Wright drew upon in designing the church proper at Unity Temple. So it's not laid out in a Latin cross. The axial organization of your movement into and through the space, the establishment of a destination at the altar, is all going to be avoided here, and avoided to a great degree. right? To the point where he's got these very complicated ways of moving into and through the building and entering into the church proper, all of which is coming from that Protestant tradition and which is informing some of the decisions that he's making here. And so, a very interesting building from Wright's early career, certainly an example of that sort of cubic architecture that that I noted at the very beginning, but also something that shows that Wright understood architectural history and drew from it, even though he was making some quite unique solutions here specifically for this building. Now, the next building that we're going to take a look at, the Roby House, is obviously an example of domestic architecture. And so let's take a look at some of the things that Wright considered to be important in domestic architecture, specifically by taking a look at these two examples, the Winslow House and the Willits House. One, again, an example of that sort of cubic solution, the other a more planar solution, but both houses built around the Chicago area in the 1890s, in the 1900s. In the Winslow House, one element that is really strongly expressed here is the roof. That structural element that sheds water and snow and that protects the interior spaces. And here it is a pretty basic geometric shape, basically this rectangular plan pyramidal shape that is really carefully separated from, distinguished from the bulk of the building, which can be considered the rectangular volume on the ground floor of the Winslow House. And because the second floor here is set up with voids of the windows or with walls that are painted dark and so sort of recede from view, it appears to be this element hovering over the house proper. And so for Wright, designing residential architecture in a climate that is for many months going to be chilly, if not really cold, with a lot of rain, a lot of snow, the roof is going to be one essential element of domestic architecture. Another element that was essential in Wright's domestic architecture, if we take a look at the plan of the building, is going to be the fireplace. And in this particular case, we can see that the fireplace is the core of the building, pretty much in the center of that rectangular plan. And whether physically or sort of representationally, it is the element that provides heat and creates the inhabitable interior spaces for the house. Now, in the 1890s, the Winslow House is going to have central heat. It just is. This is Chicago. And so the fireplace really isn't essential for the heating of the house. But Wright is going to always consider the fireplace to be the hearth, the heart of the home, the center where the family is going to gather. And so he's often going to set up the fireplace as this vertical masonry core to the home that in some cases has real fireplaces. And if we take a look at here at the Winslow House, we can see a real fireplace opening to the reception hall, opening to the dining room, opening to a second floor sitting room. It's representationally going to connect in the basement to the boiler, which is going to provide the central heat for the house. And the kitchen is often going to be sort of connected tangentially but nearby, right? With the idea that the heat that you need to cook your food is also going to be connected to this fireplace core that runs through the house. But let's take a look at how Wright is setting off the fireplace in the Winslow House, specifically in the reception hall. Here, if we imagine walking through that front door, we enter into a reception hall that in plan is sort of a sideways rectangle in plan. Directly on axis, straight ahead of us, we can see a few steps up, and there's this upper landing that is set off from the lower part of the reception hall by these two large plinths, these two banisters, that connect to banisters that go to the right and to the left and sort of protect you from falling off that elevated platform. Directly on axis, set up as your destination, is the fireplace itself, but he's setting up this seating area close to the fireplace that was called an inglenook, something that we can see in a lot of arts and crafts architecture at the time, and something that comes from the vernacular architecture of cold climates. Often people would have these smaller contained little sitting areas close to the fireplace so that during the colder months you could actually get physically close to the fire and sort of sit down and enjoy the heat. He's doing that here, but the inglenook is symmetrical along that central axis, and furthermore it is separated from other parts of the reception hall by that colonnade. What he's doing here is drawing from sacred architecture. Kind of interesting, considering that the church that he designed at about the same time avoided some of the aspects of sacred architecture. But here we see him setting up something in the Winslow House that draws upon religious architecture. We can see the central axis, the symmetry about the axis, the destination being the fireplace and that space around the fireplace, and separating it from the rest of the space with something that is very much like a rood screen, which we might see in Anglican churches or still remains in some Catholic churches, but often it's mostly monastic churches. But in England, a lot of the rood screens survived, surprisingly. But here in the upper left, we're taking a look at a church which develops upon an English tradition quite intentionally, and we can see a rood screen that's separating the nave of the church from the chancel in the area for the altar. On the right, we can see a different sort of screen for the liturgical space, in this case in an Orthodox church, a screen that's called an iconostasis, with doors and icons facing the congregational part of the church, but separating off the sacred part, which was the reserve of the clergy and around the altar. And if we take a look at these historical examples of sacred architecture, where there was this notion of sacred space, and these were design elements used to sort of create zones within sacred space, when we see Wright using similar elements and similar design principles here for the inglenook, we know that he was using these elements to set up a sort of sacred space within the home. And the sacred space that we have in the home is people gathering around the heat source, the family organizing around that hearth. And so the fireplace core in these homes is always going to be incredibly important, even though this is the only one that I know of where it's set off as sacred space. Even in the other examples, we're going to see that as an important element. If we take a look at the Willits House, we can see a very clear reliance upon the shoin architecture, or the traditional timber construction in Japanese architecture that I spoke about, and of which there was an example constructed for the World Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893, the Japanese pavilion. On the left, we can see it in that black and white image. Wright was in Chicago in 1893. We can assume that he saw the Japanese pavilion, and he, like many arts and crafts architects, was inspired by what he saw here in that traditional architecture of Japan. And so in the Willits House, we can see a reinterpretation of that. Moving away a bit from a very close reliance upon the Japanese tradition, but still something inspired by that. And one of those aspects of the Shoin style architecture, the Japanese tradition, was the space that they achieved with those movable shoji screens. One interior space could be separated from another or opened up. The interior could be opened up to the exterior. That was a flexibility and a flow of space that was very different from what we see in traditional Western architecture. And that's something that is going to be a real important point of departure and source of inspiration for Wright's architecture, even during these early years. If we take a look at the Willits House, specifically the dining room and the porch, we can see one rectangular two-dimensional plane extending away from the fireplace core, which is what holds down those different extending planes in the pinwheel plan, right in the center. But we can see one of those two-dimensional rectangular planes extending away from the fireplace core, setting up the dining room and the porch, where with those windows, there was a lot of connection between interior and exterior. The floor surface and the ceiling in the dining room visibly connected to the floor and the ceiling of the porch outside, with a little variation, but it was being expressed as the same space that just happens to be within the building envelope in the dining room and then outside the building envelope in the porch. Now, to our eyes, this doesn't look that radical, right? To our eyes, seeing this much glass and this connection between interior and exterior and that sort of extension away from the building, to our eyes isn't that radical. But this is the 1900s, and this was highly unusual. This is something that was not seen before. And Wright's even going to go further than that. If we take a look at the plan of the building, and if we can identify those four rectangular two-dimensional planes that are extending away from that fireplace core, conceptually those planes overlap as they come close to the fireplace core. And what we see happening in plan where those planes overlap is that a clear definition of the corner is beginning to get broken down. Let's take a look at the interior of the living room at the Willits House. If we look at the exterior corners of the living room, which is in the image up on the upper right here, we're going to see that the corners still exist, right? We can see where one wall comes to the other. There's a bookcase, a built-in bookcase there in the corner, but the corner still exists. If we turn around and take a look at another corner within that living room, specifically the corner in the plan, in the upper right, the corner that's connecting the living room with that entry sequence. And if we take a look here, we can see that fireplace, but the corner is dissolved. The corner of the space in the living room is not being expressed because the space sort of meanders through that opening into the upper part of the hallway and from there into the kitchen wing and into the entry wing. What Wright is doing here is he's beginning to pull apart the corners of the spaces. He's beginning to break down the strong definition of the interior geometry, which had become part of the tradition in Western architecture. Again, to our eyes, this view of the living room in the lower left isn't all that radical, right? But back in the 1900s, in a building that was designed and built by an architect, a trained architect, somebody who should know how to define a basic geometric interior volume, to have the corner begin to break down like this was something that was truly radical. Now, just to sort of drive the point home, I'd like to do a little comparison and contrast between the Willits House, which we see here on the lower plan and view, with the Gamble House, which we're taking a look at the upper plan and interior view here. In both cases, there's a strong reliance upon traditional Japanese Shoin style timber construction. In both cases, there's a flow of space from one area to the next. But let's take a look at the interior of the living room at the Gamble House. We've just come through that opening from the hallway into the living room. We're looking directly ahead through the windows at the opposite wall. And if we take a look at the plan, we can see that the space here is kind of like a Greek cross-shaped plan, right? If we take a look at the interior, we can see that there's this interior rectangular volume that is slightly separated from the arms of the Greek cross by some of the structural elements. And then to the left, we've got one arm of the Greek cross with windows that overlooks the terrace. And to the right, we can see the other arm of the Greek cross with the inglenook there. But within that main rectangular space, to either side of those windows that we see directly on axis here, you can see the corner of that rectangle. And so for as much as this is drawing inspiration from the Japanese tradition, for as much as there is a flow of space inspired by those shoji screens and the flexibility of space in Japanese architecture, we still see a central axis, symmetry about the axis, and a definition of the geometry here within the space. Now let's take a look at the Willits house. The living room, in some ways, has an axis and cross-axis here, but what's happening at the corners, whether it's to the hallway or even if we take a look at the plan into the dining room, we see that those corners that are at the locations of the overlap of those different extending planes gets broken down. And this is a radical departure from the definition of geometry that we see in Western architecture up to this point in time, and a real exploration of space within these buildings. This is going to be an incredibly important contribution that Wright is going to make to architecture. The way that the interior and the exterior connects, the way that one space extends to the next, and the way that he's breaking down the corners. This is a fundamental contribution that Wright is making. And we're going to see it if we take a look at the Robie House in Chicago, which is certainly his most famous example of residential architecture from these early years of his career. The patron of the building, or the young man who is going to commission the building from Frank Lloyd Wright, was a young businessman who inherited a business from his father. And with the money, with the business, starting a new family, being sort of progressive and forward-thinking, he had seen the architecture that Wright was doing and decided that that was going to be the right sort of architectural expression for his home. The site that he bought is on the south side of Chicago and is a long, narrow site on a larger city block. The site itself, again, not particularly large, would not permit a full pinwheel plan to the house, like we saw at the Willits house. But we're going to see that Wright is still conceiving of this in terms of extending planes. Okay? In this corner view of the lot, we see that the lot does extend quite a bit to the right, away from the corner, but it's not very deep. It's a very narrow lot. And you can see the next building, which is behind it, which is on a different lot, okay, within the city block. And so Wright's hands were really kind of tied by that. Instead of extending out in four directions with the pinwheel plan, he's setting up two parallel rectangular planes. The one which is closer to the corner, and then another which is sort of angled up to the upper right. And conceptually, those two are kind of still held down by the fireplace core that runs vertically through the house. You can see the fireplace in the view of the house from the corner there. And if we take a look at the plan, we can see that the fireplace is in the middle of one of those rectangular planes. And conceptually, the fireplace is kind of nailing down the corner of the other parallel rectangular plane, which again is just a little to the upper right in the plan of the building. And so these two planes are sort of coming together and being held down by the fireplace core. The architectural expression that we have here for the building certainly draws inspiration from traditional Japanese architecture with the low pitch to the roofs and those deep overhangs. But there are a couple of ways in which this draws inspiration from the landscape, specifically the fact that so much of northern Illinois is just the eastern edge of the flat prairie that runs all the way to the Rocky Mountains. And so that reiterated horizontal line that we can see here in the composition is sort of picking up on that horizon line, the flat surface of the earth, and sort of reiterating it here in the design. Later, Wright is going to talk about this building as if it is a ship plowing across the prairie. So instead of moving across the flat surface of Lake Michigan, which isn't that far away, here we have a boat that's sort of plowing across the flat surface of the prairie. And that horizontal is going to be something that gets picked up by the stone coping, which is at the top of any of the concrete walls. It's picked up by the eaves of the different roof lines. It's going to be a major element in the composition of the building. We can see this balcony wall and the retaining wall down on the ground floor that are sort of these horizontal stripes. And it was something that Wright brought even down to the details. He required the masons, the guys who are building the brick walls here, to use two different colors of mortar. One, which is your typical light gray mortar, which was being used for the horizontal joints between the brick. And then another color, which is going to have some aggregate or some addition to the mortar, which is going to give it a slightly pinkish tone for the vertical joints between the brick. And in this way, the horizontal joints are going to jump out differently than the vertical joints. And you're going to look at these brick walls. And the selection of brick that Wright used here was already going to be a not very tall brick, something called Roman brick, right? Not very tall, pretty long, right? And so the brick itself is going to have sort of a horizontal axis to it, right? The way that you lay it up. But with those different colors of the mortar, he's also going to emphasize the horizontal joints and minimize the vertical joints between the different bricks here. In many ways, those parapet walls, whether they're retaining walls on the ground floor, or whether they're balcony walls on the upper floor, were organized also to control the sight lines into the house, because the house was going to have to be pretty close to the sidewalk, and in order to maintain the privacy of people in the interior spaces, they really needed to think about these sight lines. And those balconies and those parapets there, in part, were designed to provide some privacy to the inside. The way that you enter into the house is a little bit convoluted here too. You don't enter from the wide facade of the house that faces, or the wide elevation of the house that faces the street. You don't enter from the narrow elevation that faces the side street. Rather, you have to walk around the end of the building to the back, go down a few steps, and enter into this lower level entryway through the doorway. And then from that doorway, if we take a look at the plan, you enter into a space that connects to the fireplace core and the vertical circulation through the building, the vertical circulation that is specifically for the patrons here, for the family itself, which is in a connection to the fireplace core. And if we take a look at these two views here, you can see that fireplace core down at the end of the living room. And from the other end, from the dining room, you can see the way that that staircase is enclosed with a little bit of built-in furniture here. But what's interesting is the way that there are no corners to the living room or the dining room. Rather, the space just continues on either side of that fireplace staircase core. And so the living room continues into the dining room, breaking down the corner, no longer having that clear definition of interior geometry that we see in traditional Western architecture. Furthermore, with all these windows, you can imagine that the connection to the exterior terrace, or on the floor above, the connection to the balcony is going to be great because of all of this glass. And down at the end of the living room, through doorways, glass doorways that also remove the corners from that end of the living room, you would connect to this exterior terrace covered by this enormous overhang. And here we can see once again Wright embracing the machine. In order to structurally support the roof up above, Wright is going to use steel in the house. This is interesting for a variety of different reasons. First of all, it's often considered to be the first use of structural steel in an American residence. Whether that's actually true or not, I don't know, but it's certainly an early example of steel used in these buildings. And it shows what Wright was willing to do with industrialization, technology, and the machine. Rather than turn his back on it, he was interested in exploring what these new materials were and what they could do. And if it allowed him to have this enormous cantilever, this enormous overhang, and create this interesting connection between interior and exterior space, then he was willing to do it. Right? Furthermore, if we come in and take a look at the details here, specifically in the stained glass windows, once again, we can see the inspiration from the window that's coming from some of the local flora, in this case, wheat. If we take a look, we can see the composition there in the wheat heads, right? But it's being designed and produced with a size of the detail and a precision of the detail and a repetition of the detail that begins to suggest manufacture, not a craftsman in a shop doing things by hand, where there are going to be imperfections just from the manufacturing of the glass and the way that the glass is leaded together. Rather, it appears that we've got something that was designed, turned into a small-scale geometric set of details here, and then mass-produced. And so we see him embracing the machine in the details as well as in the structural system. This is a great example of what we can consider a total work of art. Wright designed the furniture in the house. He designed the details. He designed clothing for Mrs. Roby. Obviously not all the clothes that she wore, but he did design some dresses that were intended to be worn when she was entertaining. Interestingly, if we take a look at the dining room furniture here, we can see the way that the dining room table and the tall backs of the chairs are setting up a space within a space. Within the dining room itself, if you can imagine being at the table where there are those light fixtures at the corners and where the backs of the chairs are going to sort of enclose the area around the dining room table, we can see a space within a space. Again, something that was vitally important to Wright and his understanding of domestic architecture. Now, what Wright was doing in these houses, in breaking down the enclosure of the space, was something that was going to be incredibly influential in the United States and in Western Europe. And when we take a look at what he was doing, specifically at the Willits House, once again, we can see inspiration from Japanese architecture, but taking it in a very unique direction in the way that he was breaking down the corners and the way that he was allowing one space to flow into the next. This was made popular, and this was also demonstrated to the world in a publication known as the Wasmuth Portfolio. In 1912, 1913, 1914, Wright and a publisher in Germany were collaborating on a publication that was going to be widely available in Western Europe, and that was going to be a series of illustrations of Wright's architecture. And it is going to make his architecture known to designers and the public in Western Europe. And it's going to communicate some of the lessons of Wright's architecture, including the breakdown of that interior geometric volume. And there are some great examples of buildings in Western Europe that are quite obviously in imitation of Wright's architecture. Down on the lower right, we're taking a look at a residence, a villa in Holland, which pretty clearly is based upon the example of Unity Temple. But it's that space and the way that Wright is breaking down the corner that is going to have a very profound effect on a small number of European architects in the years following the publication of the Wasmuth Portfolio. 1914 was a pretty tricky time to have a publication can't come out. World War I is going to begin, and for the following 4 years and a few years afterwards, the war and reconstruction after the war, getting things back in order, getting the economy back after the war. It's going to take a while before we begin to see the full effect of Wright's spatial examination. But we're going to see that there were some profound changes to the way that Europeans were taking a look at space. If we take a look at traditional European art, we're going to see that from the time of the Renaissance on, perspective was the backbone of pictorial depictions. Perspective, the way that you geometrically set up a realistic depiction of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface, and the way that that is the structure of your painting is something that had just become part of the tradition. But there's an assumption behind perspective, and that is that space is uniform and quantifiable. Okay? But with some of the scientific discoveries that we see through the 1700s, the 1800s, into the 1900s, scientists are going to begin to question those assumptions. Is space really uniform? Is a particular unit usable in spaces on the planet as well as throughout the rest of the universe? And what we have is an hypothesis that begins to become commonly known in scientific circles and eventually published, this hypothesis that time and space are not uniform and that movement through space is going to warp time and is going to warp dimension itself. One of the greatest theories that came out of this was Einstein's theory of relativity, right, where time is not uniform. But European artists are going to begin picking up on this and exploring what does it mean if time and space are not uniform. And we can see some explorations of this in what we can call Cubist art, where they intentionally show multiple viewpoints. In other words, there is no one viewpoint looking into a perspectival scene, even though that may correspond to the way that we kind of see things in the world. I mean, that's the way I look at the world. But inspired by some of these new discoveries in science, artists are going to begin to explore what does it mean if time and space are not uniform, and maybe our paintings ought to depict multiple viewpoints simultaneously. And so in these two paintings, both by Picasso, we can see portraits of women where the woman is shown from various viewpoints. Perhaps most recognizable in the one in the lower left, we can see a woman face on, and we can also see her at the same time in profile. Two different viewpoints shown in the same painting. And so we begin to see this exploration based on science, but leaving behind some of the traditions in Western art and exploring new things. At this time, in the early 1900s in particular, and especially after the end of World War I, there are all of these ideas that are gaining momentum and beginning to circulate about art and architecture. Cubist art is just one example of it. In other cases, we can see new ideas in design where they begin to look not just to updated tradition, but for really modern things, where modernity is equated with reducing down to the essential basic elements. Rather than having all of this elaborate theory and way of organizing things and adorning things and ornament and decoration, the way to move forward is to go back to what is absolutely essential, what you cannot do without. And so they're going back to essential basic things like geometry. They also went back to some art forms that in their minds were, and I'm putting this in air quotes here, and it's also quotes here, that were in their minds primitive, right? Where there wasn't this development of academic theory and thousands of years of tradition and perspective and stuff like that. Rather, it's just a very clear close connection between impetus and result, between material and artistic form. And some artists, such as the Italian painter Modigliani, very obviously drew inspiration from these, quote, primitive art forms in finding a way forward in painting. Other new ideas in design, specifically in architecture, moved in a different direction, felt that modern was all about expressing new conceptions of space and perception. We saw it with Cubist art. Now we're going to see it in a different movement called De Stijl. De Stijl was a Dutch movement from the 1900s, sort of a collaborative effort of a few different designers and artists who wanted to find the way forward into modern art and architecture by going back to the basics, primary colors, basic geometry, point, line, plane, and looking to use them in ways that is going to give form to new conceptions of space and perception. And the great architectural example of that is going to be the Schroeder House, designed by Gerrit Rietveld, one of the members of De Stijl, located in Utrecht in Holland from the 1920s, okay? So from the decade after the conclusion of World War I. Interesting commission. There was a young woman who was recently widowed and had 3 children, and she decided that she wanted a residence for herself and her children that was going to be non-traditional in a variety of different ways. The site that she had available to her was at the end of a row of houses in Utrecht, so a very standard site, a very standard neighborhood. Row houses were just common in Utrecht and throughout Holland and much of Western Europe at this point in time. And she happened to have the end lot, which meant that the architect had the opportunity to not only design a front facade, but a variety of different elevations for the building. In terms of the programming, this young woman wanted the ground floor largely for herself and the upper floor largely for the children. But especially in the children's area, she wanted a great degree of flexibility so that the children could really explore how they wanted to go about their lives. If we take a look at the ground floor of the building here in the lower right, we can see the reading room for the young woman, her artistic studio, her workroom, her bedroom, right? Kitchen and dining, living area for the whole family. But upstairs, we're going to see the space for the children. Again, living, dining, bathroom, sleeping. I think there were 2 young boys and 1 young girl. And up here, one of the ways in which the children could explore how they wanted to go about their lives was with these partitions, which could close off the different interior spaces or open up the exterior spaces, or the interior spaces. And so if we take a look up above, we can see what the interior would be like if all of the partitions were closed. And we can see individual spaces, a hallway at the top of the staircase from which you can get into the bathroom, and then into the living dining room, a work sleeping area connecting to another work sleeping area and another sleeping area, right? But down below, we can see what it's like when all of those partitions are open. And rather, we've got one large, well, not particularly large, but one space that is kind of subdivided by a few different things, by the staircase, the little fireplace, right? But open, where one space is going to flow into the next, where there is no separation of living from sleeping, from working, not even from bathroom if you don't want it, right? But it allows the children to explore how they wanted to go about their lives. And all of this is being organized in basic geometric units: point, line, plane, primary colors, red, blue, yellow, black, white, gray. But take a look at the way that one space connects to the other space on the inside, and the way that one space flows out through those windows at the corner. There is no strong definition of the corner like we might expect in traditional Western architecture. The corner is completely broken down. Much of the wall is completely broken down. And the interior space visually connects to the exterior. And there's a pretty close connection between the interior ceiling and that exterior extension of the roof plane just outside the windows. And so the space continues out. It's just that in some areas you're within the building envelope. In other areas, the space is outside the building envelope. So here we've got a great exploration of new concepts of space and time in architecture. And the flow of the space has some connection to, some inspiration from what Wright had started, perhaps more timidly, but what Wright had started a couple of decades prior in some of those residences in Chicago. Now, I need to be very clear about what I'm not saying here. I'm not saying that Wright intended this sort of architecture. Wright certainly didn't do architecture that looked like this in the 1920s. That leads me to think that he didn't want to do architecture like this in the 1920s. Perhaps some of the basic conceptions that these artists were using were a bit beyond where Wright was at the time, right? Perhaps. But what I am saying is that the sort of exploration that Wright began with breaking down the corners and connecting interior to exterior in some of his residences is picked up and taken to a further extreme by these designers. Okay? And if we take a look at the outside again, point, line, plane, and take a look at that corner window of which we took a look at the interior. And you can see that the roof plane just extends out and the glass dematerializes the corner and the views just extend out, and it's just a building envelope that is transparent building envelope that is separating the interior from the exterior. And you can see how far they're going. Now this here is a very interesting comparison and contrast. If we take a look at the Schroeder House, we're taking a look at a sort of building that is age-old, right? It's not a traditional architecture, but it's a building type that has been explored throughout the centuries. On the right-hand side, the Wainwright Building in St. Louis by Adler and Sullivan, we're taking a look at a new building type, something for which there are no historical precedents, and something that that for the American designers who had the opportunity to design these buildings was really something more than just a great commission. It was really something more than just a great job. It was really a new building type that in their minds was indicative of a new age and a new force to be reckoned with in the world. And that is specifically the United States and American economic might. And these tall office buildings in their mind were symbolic beyond being the useful space that they created. Yet if we take a look at these two solutions here, I think that we're seeing architectural solutions that are radically different in what they do and even what they intend to do. When you take a look at Sullivan, you can see something that whatever his rhetoric, whatever he's talking about, still has a connection to architectural history. It's not a one-to-one connection. He's not designing a Greek temple. He's not designing a Gothic cathedral, right? And he's not trying to make his tall office building look like either of them. But still, he's still making traditions contemporary for a new building type. The Schroeder House, on the other hand, traditional building type, yet the designers are creating something here that is completely untethered to tradition, whether it's a traditional expression of residence or whether it's any sort of architectural tradition whatsoever. And so in this course, where we're taking a look at the development of modern architecture, and when we're trying to get our heads around what different designers thought modern was and what it looked like and how we can see it in these buildings, with the Wainwright Building, new building type for a whole variety of different reasons, right? Yet an architecture that to our eyes still seems to have a connection with architectural history, even though it's pretty clearly developing upon it and making it contemporary. I think contemporary for the 1890s is the best way that we can label this. Whereas the Schroeder House, on the other hand, is something that, even to our eyes today, is modern in the way that it detaches itself from any connection to tradition or history. And so we're at an interesting point. We're getting to the point where we're moving away from tradition and where we're beginning to see some of the great examples of non-traditional architecture. And perhaps in the minds of some of these designers, it's the relationship with tradition or not that is what is defining modern, right? Would Sullivan have thought that the Wainwright building is modern? Probably, but obviously not modern in the same way that the Schroeder House is modern, right? Our vocabulary would be more contemporary or brought up to date. Did Rietveld think that he was doing something modern? Absolutely. He knew he was doing it. He intended to do it. And